Strasbourg, France, June 2018. A hotel room, curtains half drawn, the hum of a minibar the only sound. Somewhere down the hall, a film crew is packing cameras for tomorrow's shoot. They have no idea that the man they're waiting for will never walk out of that room again. By morning, the world will be asking the same question. It always asks when someone who seemed to have everything disappears. How does a man who ate his way across 100 countries, who made millions of strangers feel like they'd traveled with him, end up completely alone in a room in eastern France? The answer is not simple, and it is not what most people think they know. This is the story of Anthony Bourdain. Not the sanitized, magazine cover version. The real one. The one with the needle marks, and the rage and the years spent convinced he was a failure. Right up until the moment the whole world decided he was a legend. To understand how he got to that hotel room, you have to go back. Long before the fame. Long before the Emmy Awards. Long before CNN handed him a passport and a camera crew, and told him to go find the truth in places most travel shows wouldn't dare film. There was a kid in New Jersey who could not sit still, could not follow rules, and could not, for the life of him, figure out what he wanted to be. That restlessness would either destroy him, or make him famous. For a long time, it looked like the first one. Anthony Michael Bourdain was born on June the 25th, 1956, in Manhattan and raised across the river in Laonia, New Jersey. The son of a Columbia Records executive, and a New York Times editor. On paper, it was a comfortable, literate household, the kind that produces lawyers and professors. What it produced instead was a boy, who, according to his own later writing, felt disconnected from almost everything around him, until a single afternoon on a family trip to France cracked something open. He tried an oyster, pulled straight from the water, and something shifted. Food, he would say for the rest of his life, was the first thing that ever made him feel truly present in his own body. But an oyster does not fix a restless mind. As a teenager he drifted toward exactly the kind of trouble a comfortable suburban household is supposed to prevent. Drugs, petty defiance, a boredom so total it felt like a physical ailment. He enrolled at Vassar College, one of the most prestigious schools in the country, and dropped out after 2 years. Not because he couldn't do the work, because he didn't see the point. What happened next is the part of the story most biographies rush past. It shouldn't be rushed, because what Bourdain did after Vassar is the first sign of the man he would eventually become. Someone who would rather fail spectacularly at something real than succeed quietly at something safe. He took a summer job washing dishes at a seafood restaurant in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And in that steam, that grease, that chaos of orders barked across a cramped kitchen, he found something Vassar never gave him: a tribe. Line cooks, he'd later write, were the misfits, the outlaws, the people polite society didn't quite know what to do with. For the first time, Bourdain felt like he belonged somewhere. So he enrolled at the Culinary Institute of America, graduating in 1978, near the top of his class. It looked, for a moment, like a redemption story already. A troubled kid finds his calling. Roll credits. Except that's not what happened. Not even close. What followed was almost 2 decades of grinding, mostly anonymous work in New York City kitchens, a stretch of his life so bruising that by his own account, he came within one bad decision of losing everything. Because underneath the chef's whites, underneath the discipline of the kitchen, Bourdain was still using heroin, cocaine, a dependency that stretched across years. Hidden behind 16-hour shifts, and the industry's unspoken code: work through it, say nothing, show up tomorrow. Here is the detail that most people never hear. By his own later admission, there were nights he wasn't sure he'd see morning. Overdoses, near misses, a life that, from the outside, looked like a talented cook paying his dues, and from the inside, was a slow-motion emergency. He got clean, eventually, sometime in the mid-1980s, through sheer force of will rather than any dramatic intervention. But getting clean didn't mean things got easier. For the next 15 years, Bourdain bounced between New York kitchens, most of them forgettable, some of them disasters, all of them exhausting. By his late 30s, he was the executive chef at Brasserie Les Has, a respectable but unglamorous French bistro in Manhattan. He was pushing 40. He had a mortgage-sized restaurant industry salary and nothing saved. He would later describe himself, without exaggeration, as a career mediocrity, a guy who'd wasted his talent in his 20s, and had nothing to show for it but scar tissue and a stained apron. If the story ended there, nobody would be watching this today. But in 1999, something happened that would blow the entire trajectory of his life apart, and it started with an act of pure, reckless honesty that could have ended his career before it began. Bourdain wrote an essay, unfiltered, profane, and brutally specific. It ripped the curtain back on everything the restaurant industry tried to keep hidden from customers: the drugs, the exhaustion, the gallows humor, the sheer physical brutality of professional kitchens. He called it, "Don't eat before reading this," and he sent it to the New Yorker, fully expecting rejection. They published it, and almost overnight, a mid-tier chef nobody outside of Manhattan had heard of became a literary sensation. That essay became a book, Kitchen Confidential, Adventures in the Culinary Underbelly, released in 2000. When Bourdain was 43 years old, an age by which most people assume their big break, if it was ever coming, has already passed them by. The book was a confession, a warning label, and a love letter to kitchen life all at once. It shot to the top of the bestseller lists. Bon Appetit later named him Food Writer of the Year. But here's what almost nobody knew at the time, and what makes the whole thing more remarkable in hindsight. Bourdain wasn't trying to become famous. He assumed the book would sell a few thousand copies to industry insiders and then disappear, the way most restaurant memoirs do. He kept working the line it less has, even after it hit the bestseller list, half convinced the whole thing was a fluke that could end any day. It didn't end. It multiplied. Television came calling almost immediately, and this is where the story could have gone catastrophically wrong a second time. His first real TV venture, A Cook's Tour, was modest. But then Fox greenlit a sitcom loosely based on his book, starring a young, then unknown actor named Bradley Cooper as a fictionalized version of Bourdain, a chef battling addiction and rebuilding his career. It was canceled after 13 episodes, a near total flop. Most people, at this point, would have taken the hint and gone back to the kitchen for good. Bourdain didn't. And in 2005, he found the format that would define the rest of his life. Anthony Bourdain, No Reservations, on the Travel Channel. On the surface, it looked like a food show. It was not a food show. It was something closer to anthropology, with a cigarette hanging out of its mouth, an unflinching, sometimes uncomfortable look at how people around the world actually live, filtered through the one thing every culture on earth has in common, the table. He didn't sanitize anything. He ate street food in Vietnam before most American television would even acknowledge Vietnam existed outside of war documentaries. He sat on the floor with families in places Western audiences had only seen in news footage about conflict or poverty, and he let them simply be people, cooking, laughing, arguing, living. No Reservations ran for 8 seasons and won back-to-back Emmy Awards for cinematography. In 2013, he moved to CNN with an even more ambitious version of the same idea, Parts Unknown. By any reasonable measure, Anthony Bourdain had become one of the most influential storytellers on television. And yet, according to people who knew him and interviews he gave later in life, something had not been fixed. The restlessness that got him kicked out of polite society as a teenager, the same restlessness that once nearly killed him with a needle in his arm, had not disappeared. It had simply found a bigger stage. He was blunt about this in his own writing. Fame did not fill the hole. If anything, the constant travel, the visa stamps, the time zones, the hotel rooms in cities he could barely pronounce the names of a decade earlier, pulled him further away from anything resembling a stable life. His first marriage, too, his high school girlfriend Nancy Putkowski, had lasted 20 years before ending in divorce in 2005, right as his television career was taking off. His second marriage, to Otavia Biza, produced a daughter, Ariane, born in 2007, by all accounts the single most grounding relationship of his adult life. That marriage, too, ended, amicably, in 2016. 2 years before his death, Bourdain began a relationship with Italian actress and director Asia Argento. It was, by every account from people close to him, intense, the kind of relationship that seemed to consume him the way little else in his adult life had. In the months before his death, Argento had become a prominent figure in the Pound Metu movement, and Bourdain, characteristically, threw himself fully behind her, using his platform to amplify allegations of abuse in the entertainment industry. Friends would later describe him as emotionally raw during this period in ways they hadn't seen before. A man in his early 60s, immensely successful by any public measure, still searching for the same sense of belonging he'd first found decades earlier, elbow deep in dishwater in a Cape Cod kitchen. What was happening in his private life, in his final weeks, remains, by design, something we should be careful about claiming to fully know. Bourdain himself left no note, and those closest to him have spoken about that period with the caution of people protecting a friend's dignity rather than feeding a narrative. What is documented, and confirmed by French authorities, is this: on June 8, 2018, while in eastern France to film an episode of Parts Unknown, Anthony Bourdain was found dead by his close friend, Chef Eric Reipert, in a suicide by hanging. He was 61 years old. The news landed like a seismic shock across an industry and far beyond it. This was not, in the public imagination, supposed to happen to Anthony Bourdain. He was the guy who seemed to have solved the puzzle everyone else was still working on: how to live a genuinely interesting life, unafraid, unpretentious, endlessly curious. Tributes poured in from chefs, world leaders, and total strangers who had never met him, but felt, somehow, that they had lost a friend. And that, in the end, is the part of Anthony Bourdain's story that matters most, more than the Emmys, more than the bestseller lists, more than the 11 seasons of Parts Unknown. For decades, he had quietly, insistently pushed back against the idea that success has to look a certain way, that a failed chef in his 40s is washed up, that the only stories worth telling are the comfortable ones. He built an entire body of work on the radical idea that the most meaningful thing to strangers can do is sit down and eat together, no matter what language they speak or what their governments think of each other. His death did not erase that. If anything, it forced a harder, more honest conversation about mental health, about the private cost of a public life, about how easily we mistake someone's confidence on camera for the absence of pain. Kitchen Confidential is still read by culinary students who weren't born when it was published. Parts Unknown is still watched in dozens of languages. In dozens of countries he once sat down to eat in as a guest. So here's the question worth sitting with. Long after this video ends, how many people do we assume have it all figured out, simply because they're good at making it look that way? And if Anthony Bourdain, famous, admired, endlessly curious, was still fighting something the rest of us couldn't see, who else in our own lives might be doing exactly the same thing? This has been a look at the life of Anthony Bourdain. If this story affected you, we'd genuinely like to hear which part of it stayed with you the most.